The emergency room doors exploded open with a force that made every nurse turn their head. Two paramedics rushed in, pushing a stretcher at full speed, their faces drenched in sweat and panic. On the stretcher lay a man in his late 50s, dressed in a custom Italian suit now soaked in blood, his silver hair matted against his forehead, his eyes rolling back as his body convulsed violently. The paramedics shouted over the chaos of the ER, their voices desperate and urgent, calling for immediate attention, for someone, anyone, to save this man who was clearly slipping away with every passing second. The attending physician, Dr. Rebecca Torres, sprinted toward them, her hands already reaching for the stethoscope around her neck, her mind racing through protocols and procedures. She barely had time to assess the patient before another figure appeared at her side, a young man in his early 30s, with dark, intense eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the scene in microseconds. His name was Dr. Ethan Cole, and he was known throughout the hospital as the brilliant resident with Asperger's syndrome, the one who saw patterns where others saw chaos, the one who could solve medical puzzles that left even the most experienced doctors baffled. But he was also the one who struggled to make eye contact, who spoke in flat, precise tones that some mistook for coldness, who often stood too close or too far from people without realizing it. As Ethan approached the stretcher, his eyes locked onto the patient's trembling hand, the slight bluish tint around his lips, the irregular rise and fall of his chest. His mind began to process the information at lightning speed, categorizing symptoms, eliminating possibilities, searching for the hidden thread that connected everything. Dr. Torres glanced at him with a mixture of relief and caution, knowing that Ethan's insights could be invaluable, but also aware that his unconventional approach sometimes clashed with the rigid hierarchy of the hospital. The man on the stretcher suddenly gasped, his eyes flying open, wide with terror and confusion. He tried to sit up, his expensive watch glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights, his voice coming out in a strained, furious rasp. "Get your hands off me!" he hissed, pushing weakly at the paramedics who were trying to stabilize him. "Do you know who I am? I'm Richard Castellano. I own half the commercial real estate in this city. I don't need some public hospital touching me with your filthy hand." His words were laced with venom, each syllable dripping with entitlement and contempt. Dr. Torres stepped forward, her voice firm but calm, trying to reassure him that they were there to help, that his life was in danger, and they needed to act quickly. But Richard's eyes swept over her with dismissal, then landed on Ethan, who was standing perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Richard's trembling fingers, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Richard's face twisted into a sneer of disgust. "And who the hell is this?" he spat, his voice rising despite the obvious pain racking his body. "Is this some kind of joke? You're putting my life in the hands of someone who can't even look me in the eye." Ethan didn't respond, didn't flinch, didn't seem to register the insult at all. His focus remained absolute, his mind already 3 steps ahead, analyzing the subtle signs that everyone else was missing. Dr. Torres felt a flash of anger on Ethan's behalf, but she knew better than to engage with a patient in crisis, especially one as volatile and arrogant as Richard Castellano. She turned to the nurses, issuing rapid-fire orders for blood work, imaging, and stabilization protocol. But Richard wasn't finished. He grabbed the side of the stretcher with one hand, his knuckles white, his breathing labored, but his voice still sharp as a blade. "I want a real doctor," he demanded, his eyes blazing with fury and fear. "Not some freak who doesn't know how to act like a human being." The words hung in the air like a slap, and for a moment the entire ER seemed to free. Nurses exchanged uncomfortable glances, paramedics shifted awkwardly, and even Dr. Torres felt the sting of Richard's cruelty. But Ethan remained motionless, his expression unchanged, his eyes still fixed on Richard with an intensity that was almost set. He took a single step closer to the stretcher, his voice quiet but unnervingly precise when he finally spoke. "You're experiencing intermittent paralysis in your left hand," Ethan said, his tone devoid of emotion, each word measured and deliberate. Your pupils are unevenly dilated, you have petechiae on your neck and chest, and your breathing pattern suggests partial airway obstruction. Whatever this is, it's not a heart attack, and it's not a stroke. It's something else.
Richard stared at his near, faltering just a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. But then his pride surged, and he shook his head violently, wincing at the pain the move caused. I don't know what you think. His voice weakening, still defiant. I want someone else, someone competent, someone normal. Dr. Torres opened her mouth to V, but Ethan spoke first, his gaze never leaving Richard's face.
Your fortune can't stop this, Ethan said, his voice soft but carrying a weight that silenced the room. Whatever is happening inside your body right now doesn't care how much money you have, how many buildings you own, or how many people you think you control. If we don't figure out what this is in the next few hours, you will die, and no amount of power will change that. The word landed like a hammer, and for the first time since he had been brought into the ER, Richard Castellano had nothing to say. The trauma bay became a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The medical team moved Richard Castellano onto a hospital bed, connecting him to monitors that immediately began beeping with alarming irregularity. His heart rate spiked and dropped unpredictably. His blood pressure swung wildly between hypertensive and hypotensive ranges, and his oxygen saturation hovered just above critical level. Dr. Torres barked orders to the nurses, calling for a full metabolic panel, a tox screen, a CT scan of his brain and chest, and an ECG to rule out any cardiac abnormality. But even as the tests were being ordered, even as the machines hummed and the team worked with practiced efficiency, there was a palpable sense of unease in the room. This didn't fit any standard presentation. Richard's symptoms were a confusing mosaic that refused to align with any single diagnosis, and that uncertainty made everyone nervous. Ethan stood at the foot of the bed, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his eyes moving rapidly over every detail of Richard's condition. He noticed the way Richard's left hand twitched intermittently, the subtle asymmetry in his facial muscle, the faint rash spreading across his collarbone that could easily be mistaken for irritation from his shirt collar. His mind raced through differential diagnoses at a speed that would have been impossible for most doctors, sorting through thousands of medical cases he had memorized, cross-referencing symptoms, eliminating conditions that didn't quite fit. Dr. Torres glanced at him, her expression a mixture of expectation and impatience. "Ethan, talk to me," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the trauma bay. "What are you thinking?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to Richard, leaning down to examine the rash more closely, his face just inches from the patient's skin. Richard recoiled instinctively, his lips curling in disgust. "Get away from me," he hissed, his voice weak but still laced with contempt. "I told you I don't want you near me." Ethan ignored the insult, his focus unwavering. He reached out slowly, his fingers hovering over the rash without actually touching it, his eyes narrowing as he studied the pattern of discoloration. "This isn't an allergic reaction," he murmured, almost to himself. "The distribution is too specific. It follows the dermatome of the C4 nerve root." Dr. Torres frowned, stepping closer to look at what Ethan was seeing. "You think it's neurological?" she asked, her skepticism evident, but her curiosity piqued. Ethan nodded slowly, his mind continuing to piece together the puzzle. The paralysis, the rash, the respiratory distress, the autonomic instability. "These symptoms suggest a neurotoxin," he said, his voice gaining confidence as the pattern became clearer in his mind. "But not a common one. Something exotic, something rare." Richard let out a bitter laugh, though it came out as more of a wheeze. "A neurotoxin?" he rasped, his eyes filled with disbelief and mockery. "What am I, a character in some spy movie? This is ridiculous. You're wasting time with your crazy theories while I'm dying here." Dr. Torres held up a hand, silencing Richard's protest. "Let him finish," she said firmly, her attention now fully on Ethan. "What kind of neurotoxin are we talking about?" Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the rash, his mind sifting through obscure medical literature, case studies from remote parts of the world, toxicology reports that most doctors would never encounter in their entire career. "There's a toxin found in certain species of tropical fish," he said slowly, his voice methodical and precise. "It's called ciguatoxin. It accumulates in the food chain, starting with microscopic algae and concentrating in larger predatory fish. When humans consume contaminated fish, the toxin attacks the nervous system, causing a cascade of symptoms that can mimic everything from a heart attack to a stroke to anaphylaxis. It's almost impossible to detect with standard tests, and it doesn't show up on tox screen because it's not a drug or a poison in the conventional sense. Dr. Torres stared at him, her mind racing to process what he was suggesting. Ciguatera poisoning, she said, her voice tinged with doubt. That's incredibly rare, especially this far inland. When would he have been
exposed to tropical fish? Ethan finally looked up, his gaze shifted. Have you eaten any fish in the 48-hone newt system? Richard glared at his breathing. What does that have to do with? I eat at the finest restaurants in the city. I don't eat garbage. Ethan voiced. Did you eat fish specifically? Barracuda, grouper, snapper, or any large reef? Fish? Richard's expression flickered. I had dinner at Ciela. They served some kind of, some exotic fish. The chef said it flown in from the Caribbean. I didn't ask questions. I just ate it. Ethan's our closest thing to excite show. That's it. Quick. That's all. If the fish was contaminated.
ciguatoxin? Your symptoms align perfectly. The neurological dysfunction, the autonomic instability, the rash, everything. Dr. Torres felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with dread. Ciguatera poisoning was notoriously difficult to treat, and there was no antidote. Supportive care was the only option, and even then, the effects could last for weeks or even months. We need to confirm this, she said, turning to the nearest nurse. Get a detailed dietary history, find out exactly what he
ate, where it from, and if anyone else who ate the same fish owes him. Start aggressive support therapy, IV fluid, antihistamine, and mannitol juice neuro. Richard's face had gone pale. His earlier arrogant reality of his situation began to sink in, saying poison voice because of fish. Ethan met his gaze first time. There was something almost human. His
flicker of empathy beneath the clinical detachment. Yes, he said simply, and if we're right, you're going to survive. But it's going to be a long and difficult recovery. As the nursing staff hurried to implement Dr. Torres's orders, the trauma bay settled into a tense, watchful rhythm. Richard Castellano lay on the hospital bed, his body hooked up to monitors that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision, tracking every fluctuation in his vital sign. The initial wave of panic had subsided, replaced by a grim, exhausting vigilance. Richard's eyes darted around the room, filled with a fear he was clearly unaccustomed to feeling, a vulnerability that seemed foreign to a man who had spent his entire life in control. Dr. Torres stood at the bedside, reviewing the preliminary test results on a tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration. The blood work had come back inconclusive, showing elevated inflammatory markers and signs of neural stress, but nothing that definitively confirmed ciguatera poisoning. The CT scans were clean, ruling out any structural brain abnormalities or internal bleeding. The tox screen, as Ethan had predicted, showed no trace of conventional poisons or drug. Everything pointed toward a rare neurotoxin, but without a specific test for ciguatoxin, they were operating on educated guesswork and clinical observation. Ethan remained at the foot of the bed, his posture rigid, his hands now stuffed into the pockets of his white coat. He rocked slightly on his heel, a subtle, repetitive motion that helped him process the overwhelming sensory input of the ER. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, a sound that most people wouldn't notice, but that Ethan found intensely distracting. The smell of antiseptic and blood mingled in the air, sharp and metallic, the constant chatter of medical staff, the beeping of machines, the shuffle of feet on linoleum. It all crashed over him in waves, threatening to pull him under. He closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to breathe slowly, to compartmentalize the noise and focus on the problem at hand. Dr. Torres noticed his discomfort and stepped closer, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "Ethan, are you okay?" she asked, her tone gentle but concerned. Ethan opened his eyes, his gaze flickering briefly to her face before darting away. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was tighter than usual. "I just need to think." Before Dr. Torres could respond, the trauma bay doors swung open and a tall, imposing figure strode in with the confidence of someone who owned every room he entered. Dr. Marcus Whitman, the hospital's chief of medicine, was a man in his 60s with silver hair, a square jaw, and an air of authority that demanded respect. He was known for his exceptional surgical skills and his equally exceptional intolerance for anything he perceived as incompetent or disorderly. He stopped at the foot of Richard's bed, his sharp eyes sweeping over the patient, the monitors, and the medical team with a scrutiny that made everyone stand a little straighter. "What do we have here?" he asked, his voice deep and commanding. Dr. Torres stepped forward, summarizing the situation with professional efficiency. Richard Castellano, 57 years old, presented with acute neurological symptoms, autonomic instability, and a rash consistent with neurotoxin exposure. Dr. Cole suspects ciguatera, poisoning from contaminated fish. We're providing supportive care while we wait for confirmation. Dr. Whitman's eye shifted to Ethan, who was still standing at the foot of the bed, his gaze fixed on Richard's trembling hand. Dr. Cole, Whitman said, his tone laced with skepticism. Ciguatera poisoning? That's a rather exotic diagnosis. Do we have any concrete evidence? Or is this another one of your hunches? The word hunches was delivered with a subtle sneer, a reminder that Ethan's unconventional approach was often viewed with suspicion by the hospital's old guard. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't react to the condescension in Whit's voice. He simply nodded, his voice calm and factual. The patient consumed large reef fish from the Caribbean within the last 48 hours, he said. His symptoms are consistent with ciguatoxin exposure, paresthesia, muscle weakness, gastrointestinal distress, bradycardia, and hypertension. There is no other diagnosis that accounts for the full constellation of findings. Dr. Whitman crossed his arms, his expression hardening. Consistent with is not the same as confirmed, he said. For all we know, this could be a severe allergic reaction, a viral infection, or even a psychological response to stress. We don't have the luxury of chasing rare zebras when horses are far more common. I want a full workup for anaphylaxis, sepsis, and Guillain-Barré syndrome. We treat what we can prove, not what we
speculate. The only out frustration. Anaphylaxis would have presented with airway swelling and urticaria, neither of which are present. His growing fur. Sepsis would show signs of systemic infection, which the blood does pour. Guillain-Barré typically follows a viral illness, progresses symmetrically, but the patient's week is symmetric and accompanied by autonomic dysfunction that doesn't fit the pattern. Dr. Whitman's eyes narrowed, his patience clearly wearing thin. Dr. Cole, I respect your intelligence, but medicine is not a guessing game. We follow protocols, we rely on evidence, and we don't gamble with patients' lives based on theoretical diagnoses. Do I make myself clear? Before Ethan could respond, Richard's voice cut through the tension, weak but dripping with bitterness. Listen to him, Richard rasped, his eyes locked on Dr. Whitman. I don't want this broken robot touching me. I want a real doctor, someone who knows what they're doing. Word hit physical blow, and for the first maintained pose crack, his clenched into fists inside his pocket. His breathing quickened and his eye darted floor, unable to meet any gaze. Dr. Torres stepped forward, her voice sharp with Mr. Castellano. Dr. Cole trying to say she's her tone, no room argument. You
may not like his method, but he's one of the most brilliant diagnosticians I've ever worked with. You would do well to show some respect. Richard let out a bitter, wheezing laugh. Respect? He echoed, his voice thick with scorn. For someone who can't even hold a normal conversation, who stares at people like they're specimens in a lab? I didn't build my empire by trusting people who don't know how to function in the real world. The room fell silent, the weight of Richard's cruelty settling over everyone like a suffocating blanket. Dr. Whitman cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. Dr. Torres, proceed with the additional workup I ordered, he said, curt. Dr. Cole, you're dismissed. I'll take it from here. Ethan stood, frozen for a moment, his mind reeling, his chest tight with a pain that had nothing to do with sensory overload. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the trauma bay, his footsteps echoing in the sudden, oppressive silence. Ethan walked through the hospital corridors with mechanical precision, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his mind a storm of thoughts that refused to set. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting harsh, disorienting shadows that made the hallway seem to stretch endlessly before him. He could still hear Richard's voice echoing in his head, the words cutting deeper than any scalp. Broken robot. Freak. Someone who doesn't know how to function in the real
world. Each phrase replayed, and no matter how hard tried to push them away, they clung to him. Second gear. He turned a corner and found himself quiet alcove, hospital's wing, a small, dimly lit area, bench and a window overlooking city sky. It was a place he often retreated. World became too much. He sank onto the bench, his hands gripping the edge so tight that his knuckles turned white. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts as the weight of the day crashed down on him all at once. This wasn't the first time Ethan had been dismissed, belittled, or misunderstood because of his autism. It happened constantly in subtle and overt ways, from colleagues who questioned his judgment, from patients who recoiled at his awkwardness, from administrators who viewed him as a liability rather than an asset. He had learned to build walls around himself, to
bury his emotions beneath layers of logic and routine, to find solace in the certainty of medicine where human interactions felt like navigating a foreign language without a dictionary. But tonight, those walls felt dangerously thin and the pain was seeping through the crack. He closed his eyes and tried to employ the grounding technique his therapist had taught him. He focused on the sensation of the bench beneath him, the cool air from the window, the distant sound of traffic outside. He counted his breath, inhaling for 4 seconds, holding for 4, exhaling for 4. Slowly, the tightness in his chest began to ease and the cacophony of thoughts in his mind started to quiet. But the hurt remained, a dull, persistent ache that no amount of logic could erase. Ethan, a soft voice called from behind him. He opened his eyes and turned to see Dr. Lena Park, a fellow resident and one of the few people in the hospital who treated him with genuine kindness. She was a petite woman in her early 30s with warm, intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor that had always put Ethan at ease. She approached slowly, as if sensing that he needed space, and sat down on the bench beside him without invading his personal bubble. "I heard what happened," Lena said quietly, her voice filled with empathy. "Dr. Torres told me about the patient, about what he said to you." Ethan didn't respond immediately, his gaze returning to the window. "He's not wrong," he said finally, his voice flat and emotional. "I don't know how to function in the real world. I never have." Lena shook her head firmly. "That's not true, Ethan. You function just fine. You just function differently. And that difference is what makes you so good at what you do. You see things that no one else can see. You solve puzzles that leave the rest of us stumped. Do you know how many lives you've saved because of your so-called broken brain?" Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "It doesn't matter how many lives I save if people look at me and only see something wrong," he said. "If they can't see past the fact that I can't make eye contact, or that I speak too bluntly, or that I need everything to be in a specific order, they see a freak, a robot, someone who doesn't belong." Lena reached out slowly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Some people will always be afraid of what they don't understand," she said softly. "But that's their problem, not yours. You don't owe anyone an explanation for who you are. And the people who matter, the people who are worth your time and energy, they see you for the incredible doctor and human being that you are." Ethan let out a shaky breath, the walls he had built around himself trembling but not quite collapsing. "What if I'm wrong about the diagnosis?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "What if Dr. Whitman is right and I'm just chasing a rare condition because I'm too stubborn to consider the obvious?" Lena smiled gently. "Ethan, I've worked with you for 2 years and I've never seen you be wrong when you're this certain about something," she said. "Trust yourself, trust your instinct, and if you're wrong, which I doubt, then we'll figure it out together. But right now, that patient needs you, whether he knows it or not." Ethan looked at him, and for the first time that night, a small flicker of determination returned to his eyes. "I need to go back," he said, his voice steady. "I need to make sure they're monitoring him for the right thing. If it really is ciguatera, his condition could deteriorate rapidly without proper supportive care." Lena nodded, standing up and offering him a hand. "Then let's go," she said. "But this time, you're not going alone." Together, they walked back toward the trauma bay, and with each step, Ethan felt the storm inside him begin to set, replaced by the quiet, unwavering resolve that had always defined him as a doctor. If you're feeling the intensity of this story and want to see how Ethan's journey unfolds, hit that like button right now. And don't forget to subscribe, because this channel is dedicated to bringing you the most emotional, edge-of-your-seat medical drama inspired by The Good Doctor. Drop a comment below telling me, have you ever felt underestimated because of something that makes you different? Let's talk about it. Now let's get back to the story, because things are about to get even more intense. When Ethan and Lena returned to the trauma bay, the atmosphere had shifted. The earlier chaos had given way to a tense, methodic focus as the medical team worked through Dr. Whitman's ordered protocol. Richard Castellano was still connected to the monitors, but his condition had noticeably worsened. His breathing had become more labored, requiring supplemental oxygen through a nasal cannula. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes, though still open, held a glassy, distant quality that suggested he was slipping in and out of consciousness. Dr. Torres stood at the bedside, her expression tight with worry as she reviewed the latest lab. Dr. Whitman was speaking with one of the senior nurses, his voice low and authoritative, clearly directing the course of treatment. Ethan hesitated at the entrance to the trauma bay, his instinct instinct to retreat warring with his determination to help. Lena gave him a subtle nod of encouragement, and together they stepped inside. Dr. Torres looked up and immediately caught Ethan's eye, relief washing over her face. "Ethan, thank God you're back," she said, her voice urgent. "His condition is deteriorating. We've ruled out anaphylaxis and sepsis, and the Guillain-Barré panel won't be back for another few hours, but his neurological symptoms are progressing. He's developing bilateral foot drop and reporting severe paresthesia in his extremity. It's like his entire nervous system is misfiring." Dr. Whitman turned sharply, his eyes narrowing when he saw Ethan. "Dr. Cole, I thought I made it clear that you were dismissed," he said, his tone icy. Ethan met his gaze with quiet defiance. "With all due respect, Dr. Whitman, I believe my diagnosis is correct, and if we don't adjust our treatment approach, this patient is going to suffer permanent
nerve damage or worse." Dr. Whitman, and for a moment seemed as though he might order a room, but Dr. stepped her voice. "Marcus, let him speak. We're running out of options, and Ethan has been right. Case 4. We have Lou." Dr. Whitman but he gave her. "Fine. You have 2 minutes, Doc. Make it count." Ethan stepped close,
scanning Richard's vitals on the monitor, noting the irregular heart rate, the dropping blood pressure, the spiking temperature. "Ciguatoxin disrupts voltage-gated sodium channels in nerve cells," Ethan said, his voice steady and precise. "This causes spontaneous depolarization, leading to the symptoms we're seeing: muscle weakness, paresthesia, autonomic dysfunction, and gastrointestinal stress. Standard supportive care isn't enough because the toxin binds irreversibly to the channel. We need to administer intravenous mannitol immediately to reduce neural swelling and prevent permanent damage. We also need to increase his fluid intake to help flush the toxin from his system and consider antihistamine to counteract the inflammatory response." Dr. Whitman folded his arm, his skepticism evident. "Mannitol is typically used for cerebral edema, not toxin-induced neuropathy," he said. "What evidence do you have that it will work in this case?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "There are documented case studies from Pacific Island nations where ciguatera poisoning is more common," he said. "Mannitol has been shown to reduce the severity and duration of symptoms when administered early. It's not a cure, but it's the best intervention we have. Without it, his prognosis is poor." Dr. Torres looked at Dr. Whitman, her expression imploring. "Marcus, we have to try something," she said. "His condition is worsening, and we're not getting anywhere with the current treatment plan." Dr. Whitman stared at Ethan for a long moment, his face a mask of controlled frustration. Finally, he spoke. "Fine, start the mannitol, but if his condition deteriorates further, this is on you, Dr. Cole." Ethan nodded, his face impassive, though inside his heart was pounding. He turned to the nurse. "Prepare an IV infusion of 20% mannitol, 0.5 grams per kilogram over 15 minutes, he instructed. "Monitor his renal function closely and watch for signs of pulmonary edema. Also increase his normal saline drip to promote diuresis." As the nurse hurried to carry out the orders, Ethan allowed himself a brief moment to look at Richard. The man who had called him a freak, a broken robot, now lay helpless and vulnerable, his life hanging in the balance. Richard's eyes fluttered open, and he stared at Ethan with a mixture of confusion and fear. "You," Richard rasped, his voice barely audible. "You really think this will work?" Ethan, for the first time, was no judge in his voice, only quiet, honest. "I think it's your best chance, but you need to understand that this is going to be a difficult recovery. The effects of the toxin can last for weeks, or even you'll experience fatigue, muscle pain, sensitivity to heat and cold, possibly pressure. Your life change, and no amount of money or power can." Richard's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time since he had arrived at the hospital, he looked genuinely humble. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for what I said to you. I was scared, and I took it out on you. I had no right." Ethan didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement, and stepped back to let the nurse begin the infusion. As the mannitol flowed into Richard's veins, the room fell silent, everyone waiting, hoping, praying that Ethan's unconventional diagnosis would prove to be the key to saving this man's life. The minutes that followed the mannitol infusion felt like hours. The trauma bay was thick with tension, every member of the medical team acutely aware that they were in uncharted territory. Dr. Torres stood at Richard's bedside, her eyes fixed on the monitors, watching for any sign of improvement or decline. Ethan remained at a distance, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his body rigid with the weight of responsibility. He had staked his reputation, his credibility, and perhaps even his career on this diagnosis, and now All he could do was wait. Dr. Whitman stood near the door, his expression unreadable, but his presence was a constant reminder of the scrutiny Ethan was under. Lena had positioned herself beside Ethan, a silent pillar of support, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture meant to ground him. The first sign of change came about 10 minutes into the infusion. Richard's breathing, which had been shallow and labored, began to deepen and regulate. His oxygen saturation, which had been hovering dangerously low, ticked upward, first to 90%, then 92, then 95. Dr. Torres leaned forward, her eyes widening as she noticed the shift. "His vitals are stabilizing," she said, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. "Heart rate is coming down. Blood pressure is normalizing." Ethan allowed himself a small exhale of relief, though he didn't dare celebrate yet. He knew that the mannitol was only addressing the immediate neural swelling and that the toxin itself would take much longer to clear from Richard's system. But for now, the fact that Richard was responding at all was a victory. Richard's eye fluttered open more fully, and he looked around the room with a clarity that had been absent before. His gaze landed on Ethan, and this time there was no sneer, no contempt, only a profound weariness and something that might have been gratitude. "It's working," Richard said, his voice still weak, but stronger than before. "I can feel it. The numbness, it's not as bad. My chest doesn't feel like it's being crushed anymore." Dr. Torres nodded, her relief evident. "The mannitol is reducing the swelling around your nerve," she explained. "You're not out of the woods yet, but this is a very good sign." Dr. Whitman stepped forward, his expression softening just slightly. He looked at Ethan, and for a moment the rigid hierarchy of the hospital seemed to melt away, replaced by a mutual respect born of witnessing something extraordinary. "Dr. Cole," Whitman said, his voice quieter now, devoid of the earlier condescension. "You were right. I owe you an apology." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unused to receiving apologies from authority figures. "I was just doing my job," he said simply, his voice lacking any hint of triumph or arrogance. The diagnosis was there. It just required looking at the full picture instead of focusing on individual symptom. Dr. Whitman nodded slowly. "That's a skill not many doctors possess," he admitted. "I may not always understand your methods, Dr. Cole, but I can't argue with your result. Well done." The acknowledgement was brief, almost brusque, but coming from someone like Dr. Whitman, it carried significant weight. Ethan gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but said nothing, his attention already shifting back to Richard. Over the next few hours, Richard's condition continued to improve. The mannitol infusion was completed without incident, and his body began to respond to the supportive care. His breathing stabilized completely, allowing the medical team to remove the supplemental oxygen. His blood pressure and heart rate returned to near normal ranges, and the frightening paralysis in his extremities began to recede, replaced by a tingling sensation. That, while uncomfortable, was a sign of nerve function return. Dr. Torres ordered Richard to be moved from the trauma bay to the ICU for continued observation and monitoring. As the transport team prepared to transfer him, Richard reached out weakly and grasped Ethan's wrist, stopping him before he could leave. "Wait," Richard said, his voice hoarse but earnest. "I need to say something." Ethan paused, his body tense, unsure of what to expect. Richard looked up at him, and in his eyes there was a vulnerability that seemed entirely foreign to the arrogant millionaire who had been wheeled into the ER hours earlier. "I've spent my entire life believing that money and power were the only things that mattered," Richard said slowly, each word deliberate. "I built an empire by being ruthless, by controlling everything and everyone around me. I looked down on people who I thought were weak or different. I thought I was invincible. And tonight I realized how wrong I
was." He paused, swallowing hard, his grip on Ethan's wrist tight. "You saved my life," Richard continued, his voice breaking. "Not because I did it, not because I treated you with respect, but because you something no one could see. You didn't give up on me, gave you every call, said things hate back, stood still, some shift. You were
scared," Ethan said quietly. "Fear makes people say things they don't mean." Richard shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "I meant them when I said them, but I was wrong, and I'm sorry, truly deeply sorry." Ethan looked at him for a long moment, and then, in a rare gesture, he placed his free hand gently over Richard. "Apology accepted," he said simply. And in that moment, a bridge was built between two people who couldn't have been more different, bound together by the fragile, beautiful fact of survival. Richard Castellano spent the next 3 days in the ICU under constant observation as his body slowly began to recover from the ciguatoxin's assault. The medical team monitored his neurological function meticulously, tracking the gradual return return of sensation in his extremity, the stabilization of his autonomic responses, and the slow but steady improvement in his overall condition. Ethan visited Richard's room multiple times each day, not because it was required, but because he felt a strange sense of responsibility for this man who had come so close to death. Each visit was brief and clinical on the surface, with Ethan checking vitals, reviewing lab results, and making adjustments to Richard's treatment plan. But beneath the surface, something more profound was happening. Richard, for his part, had undergone a transformation that went far beyond the physical. The near-death experience had cracked open something inside him, a realization that his wealth, his power, and his carefully constructed empire meant nothing in the face of mortality. He found himself thinking about the people he had hurt, the bridges he had burned, the relationships he had sacrificed in the name of success. And he thought about Ethan, the man he had dismissed as broken and worthless, who had seen past his arrogance and cruelty to do what was necessary to save his life. One afternoon, as Ethan stood at the foot of Richard's bed, reviewing the latest round of test results, Richard spoke up, his voice stronger now, but still tinged with the weariness of recovery. "Dr. Cole," Richard said, his tone tentative, "can I ask you something personal?" Ethan looked up from the tablet, his expression guarded. "You can ask," he said. "I may not answer." Richard smiled faint. "Fair enough," he said. "I've been lying here for days thinking about my life, and I realize I don't really know anything about you except that you're brilliant and that you saved me. What made you want to become a doctor?" Ethan hesitated, the question catching him off guard. It was rare for anyone to ask him about himself, and even rarer for him to answer honestly, but there was something in Richard's eye, genuine curiosity and humility, that made him consider opening up. "I became a doctor because I wanted to understand things," Ethan said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "The human body is a system. It has rules, patterns, logic. When I was growing up, I struggled to understand people, social cues, emotions, unspoken rules. They all felt like a foreign language I couldn't learn. But medicine was different. It made sense. And I realized that even if I couldn't always understand why people acted the way they did, I could help them when their body failed them. I could solve problems that mattered." Richard listened intent, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said. "People are
messy, unpredictable. I spent life control them, to bend them to my will, but you accept them as they and still find a way to help. Something I never learned." He tilted his head, during Rich. "It's not about etc. It's about seeing what's really there instead of what you expect or want. That applies to medicine." Richard nodded.
First time, he felt as though he was beginning to understand the man who had saved him. Over the following days, their conversations grew longer and more personal. Richard shared stories about his childhood, his rise to wealth, and the emptiness he had felt despite all his success. Ethan, in turn, spoke about his experiences growing up autistic, the challenges he faced in medical school, and the loneliness that came from being constantly misunderstood. It was an unlikely friendship, built on mutual respect and the shared recognition of their own vulnerability. On the 5th day of Richard's hospitalization, he was finally deemed stable enough to be transferred out of the ICU and into a regular medical. It was a milestone moment, clear sign that he was on the road to recovery, though the doctors had warned him that the effects of the ciguatera would linger for weeks, possibly months. He would experience fatigue, muscle ache, heightened sensitivity to temperature changes, and potentially mood swings as his nervous system continued to heal. But he was alive, and for the first time in his life, Richard felt genuinely grateful for that fact. As the nurses prepared him for the transfer, Richard asked if he could speak privately with Ethan. Dr. Torres, who had been overseeing his care, arranged for Ethan to meet Richard in his new room once he was settled. When Ethan arrived, he found Richard sitting up in bed, looking out the window at the city skyline. The view was spectacular, a glittering expanse of lights and life, but Richard's expression was contemplative, almost melancholy. "Dr. Cole," Richard said, turning to face him, "thank you for coming. I wanted to talk to you before I leave the hospital." Ethan nodded and took a seat in the chair beside the bed, his posture stiff but attentive. "What did you want to talk about?" he asked. Richard took a deep, his hand folded in his lap. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said to me in the ER," he began. "You told me that my fortune couldn't stop what was happening to me, that no amount of power or control could change the fact that I was dying. And you were right. For the first time in my life, I was completely powerless, and it terrified me." He paused, his eyes glistening with emotion. "But more than that, it made me realize how much of my life I've wasted," Richard continued. "I built my empire by stepping on people, by caring only about profit and success. I treated people like tools, like obstacles to be overcome or resources to be exploited, and I told myself it was necessary, that it was just the way the world worked. But lying in that hospital bed knowing I might die, I realized that none of it mattered. All the money, all the power, all the buildings with my name on them, they couldn't save me. Only you could. And I treated you like you were worth." Ethan listened quiet, his expression unreadable. Richard leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I want to change," he said. "I don't know if I can undo all the damage I've caused, but I want to try. I want to be a better person, and I want to start by helping others the way you helped me." Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering Richard's words. "How do you plan to do that?" he asked. Richard smiled faintly. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "I have resources, connection, influence. I could use those things to make a real difference. I could fund medical research, support hospitals, create programs to help people who don't have access to quality healthcare. I could stop thinking only about myself and start thinking about how I can contribute to something bigger." He paused, his gaze locking onto Ethan. "And I want you to help me," Richard said. "I want you to advise me, to make sure that whatever I do actually makes a difference and isn't just some vanity project. You see the world differently than I do, and I think I need that perspective." Ethan was silent for a long moment, processing the request. Finally, he spoke. "I'll help you," he said, "but on one condition. You have to mean it. Not just now, while you're still scared and grateful to be alive, but a year from now, 5 years from now, when the memory of this has faded and you're back to feeling invincible. You have to commit to being better, not just feeling better." Richard nodded solemnly. "I understand, and I promise you I will." Ethan stood, extending his hand. Richard took it, and they shook, a simple gesture that marked the beginning of a partnership neither of them could have imagined just days earlier. 3 months after Richard Castellano's near-death experience, the city began to see the tangible results of his transformation. True to his word, Richard had redirected a significant portion of his wealth and influence toward philanthropic efforts, with a particular focus on healthcare. He established the Castellano Foundation for Medical Excellence, a non-profit organization dedicated to funding cutting-edge medical research, supporting under-resourced hospitals, and providing scholarships for medical students from disadvantaged backgrounds. But Richard's commitment went beyond simply writing checks. He became personally involved in the foundation's work, attending board meetings, visiting hospitals, and meeting with patients and healthcare workers to understand their needs and challenges. He sought Ethan's guidance at every step, valuing his insights and his unwavering commitment to patient care. Ethan, for his part, found the collaboration both rewarding and exhausting. Working with Richard required navigating a world of business and politics that felt as foreign to him as his autism felt to others. But he appreciated Richard's genuine desire to make a difference, and he was determined to ensure that the foundation's efforts were grounded in real, practical impact rather than superficial gestures. One of the foundation's first major initiatives was to fund a new neurotoxicology research center at the hospital where Richard had been treated. The center would focus on studying rare toxins and developing better diagnostic tools and treat for poisoning cases that were often overlooked or misunderstood. Ethan was appointed as a consulting advisor for the center, a role that allowed him to shape its research priorities and ensure that it addressed the kinds of medical mysteries he was so passionate about solving. The announcement of the research center generated significant media attention, and Richard found himself in the unfamiliar position of being celebrated not for his wealth, business acumen, but for his generosity and commitment to public health. Reporters asked him about his motivations, and Richard was candid about his near-death experience and the autistic doctor who had saved his life. "I was a fool," Richard told one journalist during a televised interview. "I thought I had all the answers because I had all the money. But when I was lying in that hospital bed, dying from something I couldn't control, I realized how little I actually knew. Dr. Ethan Cole saved my life, not because he had to, but because he saw something no one else could see. He didn't give up on me, even when I gave him every reason to, and that changed me." The interview went viral, sparking conversations about the value of neurodiversity in medicine, the importance of humility, and the ways in which near-death experiences can transform people's priorities. Ethan, who had never sought publicity and found the media attention deeply uncomfortable, tried to avoid the spotlight as much as possible, but he couldn't escape the fact that his story was inspiring others, and he received letters and messages messages from people all over the world. Parents of autistic children, medical students with disabilities, patients who had felt dismissed by the healthcare system, thanking him for showing that being different could be a strength, not a weakness. One evening, as Ethan sat in his small apartment, sorting through yet another stack of letters, his phone rang. It was Richard. "Ethan, I hope I'm not disturbing you," Richard said, his tone warm and familiar. "Not at all," Ethan replied, setting the letters aside. "What's going on?" "I wanted to invite you to an event," Richard said. "The foundation is hosting its first annual gala next month to raise funds for the Neurotoxicology Center. I'd like you to be the keynote speaker." Ethan's stomach tightened at the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people, making small talk, giving a speech. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said carefully. "Public speaking isn't my strength." Richard chuckled softly. "I know it's not," he said, "but that's exactly why I think you should do it. People need to hear your story. They need to see that brilliance comes in many forms and that the world is better when we embrace those differences instead of fearing them. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. Finally, he spoke. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I ask," Richard replied. And as Ethan hung up the phone, he realized that perhaps, just perhaps, he was ready to step into the light. The night of the Castellano Foundation Gala arrived with all the grandeur and opulence befitting an event hosted by one of the city's wealthiest philanthropists. The venue was a historic ballroom, its soaring ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers, its walls draped in elegant fabric, its floors polished to a mirror shine. Guests arrived in tuxedos and evening gowns, mingling over champagne and hors d'oeuvres, their conversations buzzing with excitement and curiosity. But for Ethan Cole, the scene was nothing short of sensory overload. The clinking of glasses, the rustle of expensive fabric, the cacophony of laughter and chatter, it all crashed over him in waves, threatening to pull him under. He stood near the entrance, his hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his suit, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape route. Lena Park appeared at his side, looking radiant in a simple but elegant dress. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You've got this," she said softly. "Just focus on the message. Forget about the crowd." Ethan nodded, though his anxiety remained palpable. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, writing and rewriting his speech, practicing in front of a mirror, trying to anticipate every possible way things could go wrong. But now that the moment had arrived, all his preparation felt inadequate. Richard spotted them from across the room and made his way over, his face lit up with genuine warmth. He looked healthier than he had in months, the lingering effects of the ciguatoxin finally fading, replaced by a vitality that came from living with purpose. "Ethan, Lena, I'm so glad you're here," Richard said, shaking Ethan's hand firmly. "Are you ready?" Ethan took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be," he said. Richard smiled. "That's all anyone can ask for," he said. "Just remember, everyone in this room is here because they believe in what we're doing. They want to hear from you." A few minutes later, Richard took the stage, his presence commanding the room's attention. He spoke eloquently about the Foundation's mission, the importance of supporting medical research, and the transformative power of second chance. And then he introduced Ethan. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, his voice filled with emotion, 3 months ago I was lying in a hospital bed, convinced I was going to die. I was arrogant, dismissive, utterly terrified. Brilliant young doc walked into, not because I deserved, but because he saw what no one else could. Dr. Ethan Cole's not like most docs. He sees the world different. He thinks different because of saves others would call. Tonight, I have the honor to introduce, please well, Dr. Ethan Cole. The room erupted. Ethan felt his heart pounding in his chest as he made his way to the stage. The lights were blinding, the sea of faces overwhelming, but he forced himself to focus on Richard's words. "Just be yourself." He reached the microphone, his hands gripping the podium for support. For a moment, he stood in silence, his mind racing, his breath shallow, and then he began to speak. "I'm not good at this," Ethan said, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't like crowds. I don't like small talk. I don't always understand social cues, and I've spent most of my life feeling like I don't quite fit in anywhere. But I became a doctor because I wanted to help people, and I've learned that sometimes the very things that make us different are the things that allow us to make the biggest difference." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, and for the first time he didn't look away. "Medicine is about pattern," Ethan continued. "It's about seeing the connections that others miss, asking the questions that others don't think to ask, and refusing to give up even when the answer isn't obvious. But it's also about empathy, about understanding that every patient is a person with a story story, with fears, with hope, and sometimes the best way to help them is to see them not as a diagnosis, but as a human being who deserves compassion and respect. His voice grew stronger, more confident. Richard Castellano came into my emergency room as a stranger who was
rude, dismissive, and yes, hurt, but he was also scared. And in that moment, none of his flaws. What mattered was that he needed help. I had the ability to. That's what medicine is. That's what humanity. It's about showing up for it, even when it's hard, even when we don't get anything in return. Room side, every eye fixed. So tonight, I ask you to support Foundation because of
me, but because of all the people out there who are suffering from conditions we don't yet understand, who are dismissed because their symptoms don't fit neatly into a textbook, who are told there's nothing more we can do. Let's prove them wrong. Let's keep asking questions. Let's keep searching for answers, and let's do it together. Ethan stepped back from the microphone and for a moment was silent. And then the room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that echoed through the ballroom. Ethan felt tears prick at the corners of his eye, not because he craved recognition, but because he realized that maybe, just maybe, his message had been heard. 6 months later, the Castellano Neurotoxicology Research Center officially opened its door. The state-of-the-art facility was a beacon of hope for patients with rare and complex poisoning cases, and it quickly gained a reputation for its innovative research and compassionate care. Ethan continued his work at the hospital, saving lives one diagnosis at a time. His reputation as a brilliant but unconventional doctor firmly established. Richard remained deeply involved in the Foundation's work, dedicating his time and resources to causes that mattered. He had reconnected with his estranged daughter, rebuilt relationships he had neglected, and found a sense of fulfillment that his wealth had never provided. And every few weeks he and Ethan would meet for coffee, two unlikely friends, brought together by a moment of crisis and bound by a shared commitment to making the world a little better. One afternoon, as they sat in a quiet cafe, Richard looked at Ethan with a smile. "You know," Richard said, "I never thought I'd say this, but almost dying was the best thing that ever happened to me." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's a strange thing to be grateful for," he said. Richard laughed. "Maybe," he admitted, "but it's true. It taught me what really matters, and it brought you into my life. So thank you, Ethan, for everything." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you for listening," he said simply. And in that moment, sitting in a quiet cafe, two men who had once been strangers found peace in the knowledge that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the most unexpected places. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you that everyone has the power to change, then please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below telling me what's the biggest lesson you've learned from an unexpected experience. Let's keep this conversation going. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.